You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 20th of September 2021 on Monocle 24. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist coming to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead... North Korea says it successfully tested a long-range cruise missile capable of hitting much of Japan. And new satellite imagery shows Pyongyang is expanding a uranium enrichment plant. We'll examine the situation. The Greek Prime Minister said Mediterranean nations must lead the way in addressing climate change. We'll look at the Athens Declaration and the other topics covered at Friday's conference of the Med7. With under a week to go until elections, we turn our gaze to Germany and the race to replace Angela Merkel. Then...
this is the first time that it'll be back as a kind of real deal. And I think, you know, the market and curators and all sorts of different sort of spokes of the wheel are just super excited.
We'll preview Art Basel, take a look at a new photo book showcasing the varied world of the newsroom, get a roundup of aviation news and have a rustle through the papers too. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Russia's ruling United Russia Party, which supports President Vladimir Putin, has retained its parliamentary majority despite losing over a tenth of its support, partial election results show. US authorities have flown out over 3,000 migrants from a Texas border city, where thousands of mostly Haitians have gathered under a bridge after crossing the Rio Grande River from Mexico. And Australia's New South Wales state has reported its lowest rise in daily COVID-19 cases in more than 3 weeks, as some lockdown restrictions were eased in Sydney amid higher vaccination levels. Do stay tuned to Monocle 24 throughout the day for more on those stories. But first, we begin the show on the Korean peninsula, where both the north and south have test-fired missiles within hours of each other. Pyongyang launched cruise missiles towards the sea in tests seen as an effort to strengthen its attack capability on South Korea and Japan. And the country also claims to have successfully launched ballistic missiles from a train. A new report says satellite images show North Korea is expanding a uranium enrichment plant. Well, here to unpack all this is Stephen Borowicz, who is a journalist based in Seoul, and John Nilsson-Wright, a senior lecturer in modern Japan at Cambridge University. Welcome to you both. Steve, if we could begin with you, can you describe the recent tests by both North and South?
What's notable about the North Korean tests is they've been testing launching a missile from a train, which is the objective of that is to make it more difficult for enemies to be able to predict where a launch might come from, or to be able to take out launching sites. On the South Korean side, they've been working towards developing a submarine launch ballistic missile, which means that they can launch something from underwater, which is a capability that only a relatively small number of countries in the world have. What's most interesting about this, at least in the short term, is just the timing. These tests came within a very short time of each other, and they kind of signal a possible arms race on the Korean peninsula, you know, after a few years of having a left-leaning administration in the south that had signaled a pretty dogged determination to make things better with North Korea and to achieve a kind of peace. I wonder how much this has to do with the presidential elections that are set to take place here next year, and that the political parties here are already jockeying, trying to get position ahead of. I wonder if this is possibly the Moon administration trying to move a little bit into the center and trying to signal to the electorate that he is in fact not naive about the threat that North Korea poses and is taking that threat seriously and is trying to buttress South Korea's national security.
But on the north side, I mean, the timing is extraordinary when you look at all the issues that Pyongyang is facing right now.
Yes, but it's not surprising when you consider the bigger context of how the North Korean leadership operates. I mean, they've been unresponsive to domestic challenges like poverty and scarcity of resources for a long time. They've long showed a willingness to invest in weapons at the expense of nearly everything else, and they seem to be more interested in kind of signaling to the outside world than they are in addressing the very real problems faced by the populace, specifically the coronavirus outbreak and the biting effects of sanctions. So this is just the latest bit of political theater on the peninsula. We'll have to wait and see just what kind of long-term significance this has.
John, the Japanese military say that North Korea's 2 short-range ballistic missiles landed inside Japan's exclusive economic zone, but outside of its territorial waters. What does that mean for Japan?
I think it means a number of things. We understand that these ballistic missiles launched on Wednesday were designed to follow a kind of varying trajectory, which has been a source of alarm to the Japanese and frankly also to the Americans, because it means it's hard to track them. And I think the element of surprise will have been a source of concern for many politicians and defense planners in Japan. The debate at the moment is how best to deal with the long-term missile threat, both from ballistic and, of course, those earlier cruise missiles that were a subject of discussion earlier in the week. The mood in Japan at the moment is about how well equipped the country is to defend against such attacks. Japan's missile defense framework is based on 2 factors: Patriot missile batteries based on the territory of Japan and mobile Aegis destroyer interceptors. Now, those interceptors are really designed to protect the southeastern part of Japan, primarily against threats coming from China. And the worry now is that the Japanese don't have the capacity to deal with an attack on Japanese territory coming from North Korea. That has spawned a debate within the defense community, and some of the leading candidates succeed the outgoing Prime Minister Suga, about possible so-called preemption, allowing Japanese defense forces to attack missiles on North Korean territory before they're actually launched. That is problematic for Japan because under its peace constitution, Japan's security policy should be defined as entirely defensive. Preemption takes it into a new area as a source of concern, and we're seeing that in the debate between some of the leading candidates. The most obvious, I think, issue for the front runner, Mr. Kono, a former defense secretary, who was in fact responsible for cancelling plans for an Aegis ashore-based system, which would have actually dealt with this very problem. Mr. Kono has had to tread, if you like, a fine line. And I suspect he will be exposed to criticism from some of his rivals for arguably, in their views, having left Japan more vulnerable to these sorts of threats.
Steve, the South Korean defence isn't nuclear and instead it relies on US forces. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, the United States and South Korea have a very close alliance, and the term that they use is umbrella, that South Korea is under the U.S.'s nuclear umbrella, which means that while there are no nuclear weapons stationed in South Korea, the U.S. would come to South Korea's defense, possibly including the use of nuclear weapons if it came down to that. What tends to happen in the South at the times when these tensions rise, and something that we're seeing now, is South Korean politicians on the right end of the spectrum, they argue that what the country really ought to do is, instead of repeating calls for North Korea to negotiate away its nuclear weapons, South Korea should sort of more sternly reckon with the reality of North Korea as a nuclear-armed state and perhaps even develop nuclear weapons of its own. So just the recent tests that we've been discussing, they do signal what I think is at least a shift in posture by the current government, in that they have turned away from asking North Korea to negotiate, and they have made this assertive move towards buttressing their own weapons capability. And that's not entirely surprising because, regardless of who's in power in South Korea, the government has pretty close relations with a lot of weapons manufacturers, and there's a very big defense budget that doesn't fluctuate too much depending on who's in government. So this is not entirely surprising, but I guess our job is more to parse the the appearances and the rhetoric and to see what this means politically.
John, the US, as we know, is a close military and economic ally of both Japan and South Korea, but ties between those Asian neighbours have often been strained. I mean, historically, going back to the Second World War and before. Clearly now, the two nations need to work together. Can they overlook their differences to do so?
Yes, I think they can, particularly when these sorts of critical issues emerge. We are anticipating a meeting between the foreign ministers of both South Korea and Japan in Washington shortly. This, I think, is emblematic of the Biden administration's focus on enhancing alliance cooperation. Sung Kim, the US Special Representative for North Korea, recently was in Tokyo for meetings with his South Korean and Japanese counterparts. And in fact, Mr. Kono, of course, that candidate to succeed Prime Minister Suga, has talked very importantly about strengthening deterrence, which will be very much part of that framework of trilateral cooperation. The problem, I think, is in part a reflection of public opinion and the emotional tension between Seoul and Tokyo. Those tensions haven't disappeared. Issues over history remain a rumbling concern, which will periodically, I think, unsettle relations. But when it comes to security, I suppose the reassuring news is that the grown-ups on all sides of the relationship are working together quite closely to harmonise their approach towards North Korea. But North Korea knows that it can try and drive wedges between the United States and its allies. That's part of its past playbook, if you like. And I think what we're seeing here with the North Koreans is to some extent quite logical, because precisely because of those domestic difficulties at home that you mentioned, the North Korean leadership, I think, by seeking a provocation with its neighbours, can perhaps distract public opinion at home from some of those domestic issues. It can make good on its planned response to the August manoeuvres between the South Korean and US militaries, and most importantly, ahead of hopefully new discussions with officials in Washington, the North Koreans are, if you like, laying out some of their bargaining chips, their conventional capabilities as well as their nuclear assets, in an effort, I think, to strengthen their position in any future negotiations with the United States.
John, thank you very much. That was John Nilsson right there and Stephen Borowick. Thanks for joining us both on The Globalist. On Friday, Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis hosted leaders of 9 southern European nations on the front line of climate change. They called for urgent global action as part of an Athens declaration. The Euro-Med7 conference was attended by the leaders of Cyprus, France, Italy, Malta, Portugal and Spain. The European Union's Ursula von der Leyen was also there, and representatives from Slovenia and Croatia too. Well, Mary Fitzgerald, a researcher focusing on Libya, was watching closely. Mary, can you tell us a little bit more about this group, the Med7? It was established about a decade ago.
That's right. By the countries that you outlined in terms of attendees last Friday, and the whole purpose of the Med7 was basically for those countries that located on the Mediterranean to come together to discuss shared challenges and see opportunities for collaboration to tackle those challenges. There have been a number of meetings this year. There was a meeting in June, which was in preparation for Friday's event, and it was quite noticeable that there was a difference in tone, I think, in this meeting compared to the last summit. In 2020, where there was a very stern warning issued to Turkey over what the delegates considered to be its confrontational behavior in the Mediterranean. This meeting on Friday, the Greek Prime Minister was describing Turkey as a key partner in terms of meeting the challenge posed by migration, particularly after recent developments in Afghanistan, when it is expected that both Greece and Turkey will be dealing with a flow of refugees coming from Afghanistan. So a distinct change of tone and mood, which is quite interesting, given that we know relations between Greece and Turkey generally tend to be quite strained. Quite a noticeable change in tone, which hints at possible collaboration between Turkey and Greece on the migration issue.
Now, climate change was high on the agenda. So what does the Athens Declaration set out in response to that?
It's essentially an urgent call for global action. The countries of the Mediterranean reminding the rest of the world that this year the Mediterranean experienced record temperatures. Greece in particular was hit by devastating wildfires. It also was hit by serious floods earlier this year. Turkey also had to deal with those wildfires. Again, an interesting kind of area in terms of possible collaboration there. But basically, the Greek Prime Minister was saying, that the Mediterranean will be one of the hardest hit regions in the world when it comes to the climate emergency. He told journalists he no longer wants to talk about climate change. He said it's a climate emergency. It's no longer a question of changing. And he urged greater cooperation between the countries of the Med7, but also more support globally.
And I wonder how that feeds into COP26 in Glasgow next month.
Well, it very much the message that the Med7 countries want to send again is that they feel that their region will be one of the hardest hit by the climate emergency. They feel that that steps need to be taken immediately in terms of mitigating the future effects of the climate emergency. And I think, part of this as well from an EU perspective is support in terms of when countries around the Mediterranean experience things like wildfires and floods, that there is support coming from their EU partners in that immediate sense.
Was the inclusion of Croatia and Slovenia significant?
Yes, in that it indicates that the Med7 grouping as a whole is quite kind of ambitious in its reach, and bringing in Croatia and Slovenia, obviously more recent members of the European Union compared to the others. Hence, I think at the reach that the Med7 grouping wants to basically continue and sees that this is very much an effort that is collaborative in terms of bringing as many countries as possible that sit around the Mediterranean together. I think it raises an interesting question in terms of the Med7 is comprised at present of EU member states. Question of whether the Med7 in future may expand to include those in the southern Mediterranean, so across North Africa and possibly the eastern Mediterranean as well.
How seriously is the group taken? I mean, how much weight does it have in its present form?
Well, it's just a decade old, as you mentioned earlier. It's relatively small in a sense, but the fact that it was able to command the attention of the European Commission head Ursula von der Leyen, etc. The fact that it was able to bring the prime ministers and presidents together, Emmanuel Macron of France was at Friday's summit, shows that this is something that is taken seriously by the members of the Med7 and also their partners in Brussels.
Mary, thank you very much indeed. That was Mary Fitzgerald. Now, still to come on the programme, we unpack the forthcoming German elections and...
One of the earlier spaces I was a huge fan of because I think it was probably the oldest space, which was the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. It looked like the newsroom hadn't been changed or upgraded in any way for many, many years. And there's an attraction to that for me. There was kind of a nostalgia to it.
We'll look at a new photo book which shows newsrooms around the world. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Monocle's September issue includes a media special as we meet the anchors, survey the newsrooms and highlight the brands with ideas, integrity and sunny stories to tell. Let's flick through some of the highlights.
We profile a rather traditional industry in the culture pages. We see how newswires and agencies, some centuries old, are retaining their hold by being present and keeping boots firmly on the ground. How's that for a good news story?
Order a copy of Monocle's September issue today or subscribe to get instant access to our digital editions.
The last major televised debate between the three Chancellor candidates of Germany took place last night, 1 week before the country goes to the polls to vote for Angela Merkel's replacement. Suda David Wilp, Deputy Director of the Berlin office of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, joins me on the line now. Suda, was there a clear winner in this debate?
Good morning, Georgina. I guess like in the two previous debates, Olaf Scholz managed to convince voters that he is the legitimate heir to Angela Merkel, and he didn't have to do much. He just had to sort of give a perception of continuity and also not say much. And voters seem to think that he should be the next chancellor. And he, according to Snap polls, won again yesterday, as he had done in the two previous debates.
Just unpack those polls for us. Where are the top three contenders in terms of numbers?
Sure. Well, if you look at the polls, the major parties, or the three parties that have put up chancellor candidates, are not too far away from each other. I mean, the Greens have certainly lost a lot of ground. They were neck and neck with the CDU, the Conservatives, and the Social Democrats before, but now they're at about 16%. Whereas the two major parties, the center-left party, the SPD, has come back from the dead and is now leading by around 5 points with 26%, and the CDU-CSU following at 21%.
What were the main themes of this debate?
Well, the themes, like in the two previous debates, have been very focused on domestic issues, kitchen table issues like healthcare, also income inequality, minimum wage, also taxes. Very little about foreign policy, for example, Germany's role in Europe and the transatlantic relationship. There was a question on Afghanistan at the first debate, but then everybody moved on to more domestic issues. Climate change is a different one. That's obviously a transnational issue, but it was still being framed in a very domestic method or domestic frame.
Now, the vote takes place on Sunday, as we know, but it could be weeks or even months until we know how the country will be governed, because coalition discussions will need to take place. What are the likely outcomes?
I mean, this is true. The past two federal elections, it took a long time for a coalition agreement to be hammered out. And I don't know how long it will take. It seems like most voters and the politicians don't want to have a repeat of the Grand Coalition, where the two major parties get together to have a majority government. And it seems likely that it will take three parties to form a coalition this time, although things are very fluid, that it could be enough for Scholz, if he remains the front runner, to form a coalition with the Green Party. And last night, it became very clear that Annalena Baerbock was looking to form a coalition with the SPD after the election. So that already kind of one hurdle has already been crossed. And she clearly said that the CDU should go into the opposition after being in power for 16 years.
And is there an obvious kingmaker?
It looks like the FDP is going to get its traditional role to be a kingmaker again. The FDP was the kingmaker in post-war German politics for decades, until the Greens sort of captured that role in 1998. But and then they, of course, left the Bundestag because they couldn't make the 5% hurdle in 2013. But Christian Lindner brought them back in 2017, and they're polling quite strongly at 11%. They had a party convention yesterday where he said he'd like to actually, beat the Greens for third place. So it looks like he's in pole position to perhaps form to be the kingmaker if it ends up being a three-party coalition.
I wonder how might each of the three influence politics beyond Germany's borders. What will their foreign policy be, and does it vary much?
To be honest with you, among the three parties, the SPD, CDU, and Greens, there are nuances, but most of the policies are quite similar. They believe in a strong Europe, a strong transatlantic partnership, collective security with NATO. But again, there are minor differences, but could cause pretty big ripple effects. For example, the CDU is not for a continuation of mutual debt within the European Union. The Coronavirus Recovery Fund is supposed to be a one-time thing. They're solidly, adherence to the balanced budget and a debt break in Germany, whereas the SPD and the Greens are looking to spend more on social services and would be perhaps open to more mutual debt with the European Union. But Olaf Scholz is a moderate and may want to have to define those or put time constraints on mutual debt. And the Greens are also against, nuclear weapons on German soil. So that can cause also some conflict with the U.S. But I don't know, all these things will have to be compromises once the coalition agreement talks begin.
I wonder if there's a sense that the European Union without Angela Merkel is somewhat rudderless. I mean, as one columnist described it over the weekend, summits without Merkel will be like Agatha Christie without Miss Marple.
Yeah, she definitely has the, that reputation of being a workhorse throughout the night and relishing a long night negotiations or negotiations throughout the night. It seems like I think the key would be for France and Germany to sort of have the Franco-German relationship be the core of the European Union. But that looks very difficult at the moment since Germany is in the midst of an election and France is already embarking on an election campaign for next year. And that has not been the case under Merkel. She's been a personality that sort of brought Europe together. But the German government has not really been very receptive to French overtures about how to make the European Union stronger. And that may now change depending on who is in government in Berlin at the end of the year.
And finally, Sudha, what's the general feeling in Germany right now?
So I think most voters are in disbelief that Angela Merkel is stepping down after 16 years. There's a whole generation of, young people that don't know anybody else as a political leader except for Angela Merkel. And what's surprising is that 40% of Germans are supposedly still undecided about which party to vote for. And the other thing is I think that the system here is also changing where it's becoming more personality driven rather than party driven, which is supposed to be the case in a parliamentary system.
Sudha, thank you very much indeed. That's Sudha David Wilp. And here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Russia's ruling United Russia Party, which supports President Vladimir Putin, has retained its parliamentary majority despite losing over a tenth of its support, partial election results show. The vote was tightly managed by the Kremlin and stripped of all but a few independent candidates, some of whom had to campaign from jail or run against doppelganger rivals who changed their names to confuse voters. US authorities have flown out over 3,000 migrants from a Texas border city, where thousands of mostly Haitians have gathered under a bridge after crossing the Rio Grande River from Mexico. About 13,000 would-be immigrants have been awaiting immigration processing. An emergency US public health order, known as Title 42, allows authorities to expel most migrants before they can claim asylum. And Australia's New South Wales state has reported its lowest rise in daily COVID-19 cases in more than 3 weeks as some lockdown restrictions were eased in Sydney amid higher vaccination levels. Nearly half of Australia's 25 million people are in lockdown after the Delta variant spread rapidly in Sydney and Melbourne. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. This week sees the return of Art Basel, one of the most important dates in the international art world's calendar. 272 galleries and many more visitors are set to descend on the city in northwest Switzerland for a triumphant in-person return following the cancellation of the 2020 event. To find out more about what we can expect and why there will never be a substitute for viewing art in the flesh, Monocle's Tom Edwards recently caught up with Monocle on Culture presenter Robert Bound.
Robert Bound, can I describe you as a veteran attender of art fairs in a polite way?
Yeah.
Well, I just did.
Yeah, you're saying I've been around.
What can we expect? Look, Art Basel returns. kind of properly at the end of the week, and it's very exciting for a lot of sort of market watchers and so forth. But I guess maybe give us a sense, given you've attended Art Basel often and lots of other fairs, what have we been missing over the last kind of 18 months or so?
That physical moment, Tom. We've been missing getting our eyeballs engaged with the paint, with sculpture, with wonderful works of art, those physical meetings with gallerists, with friends, with dealers, with curators. So much business is done that is not art market business. That's not the sort of top line of commercial galleries. Of course, a lot of that will be done next week. And I'm sure Art Basel are looking forward to a profitable fair. But I think most of all of us are kind of wishing for a fair that's sort of profitable in a bit more of a sort of pastoral sense, right? We all want to meet the people we've missed. And this is the first big deal fair that's kind of come back physically. The Hong Kong iteration kind of came back in the spring, which was good, but it had these kind of famous ghost booths where people kind of flew in their works, but not their staff. So it's a bit of a strange one. This is the first time that it'll be back as a kind of real deal. And I think, the market and curators and all sorts of different sort of spokes of the wheel are just super excited.
And Rob, how do you think then fairs go about the job, which I suppose is kind of important, of reclaiming their primacy, if you like? We know about the shift to digital. It's been expedient. It makes sense. We understand it. But how do fairs go about doing that? Is it about the works they show? Can they rely on people's joyous return to all of those human connections as being in itself enough? Strategically, what does that look like, do you think?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think it's one of these things that, once you've opened the box, it's difficult to put everything, stuff all your toys back in. Online sales will make up a lot of sales. They'll make up a lot of absentee bids, as it were. I know we're not talking about auctions, but, the Asian and American buyers, collectors, will be thinner on the ground in Switzerland this year. So maybe those online sales will be sort of prearranged. There will be viewing rooms for sort of VVIPs and that sort of thing, I'd have thought. But the physical sort of stamps its authority on the digital by virtue of the fact that you can reach out and touch it. I mean, I think that's what everyone has missed so much. And I think painting is in the primacy again. I mean, in a sort of upside down world, everyone turns to painting as the thing to invest in, as the hearth, the warm hearth in the art world to gather around, right? And people want to see paint. That's not like a photographic print or something that you can kind of look at online and probably fall in love with. You need to see this stuff up close and personal. I think that's how you stamp. I think that's how the physical stamps its authority on it. And as I say again, by all these spokes in the wheel, by the physical meeting of people. Missing each other, I think, is a massive sort of underplayed deal that no amount of, amazing online viewing rooms and Zoom links can ever put out of fashion.
Well, to that point then, do you think that gallerists, and I guess in particular artists who are working and are looking to show their work and they want it to be in front of people's eyeballs, as you say, is it simply the case that they continue to care more about fairs than digital? Or do you think in some ways the last 18 months have challenged some of the preconceptions, even from, if you like, traditionalists? And I don't mean that pejoratively.
Yeah, I think, well, also I think artists, it's an interesting question. I think artists are more into art fairs than they've ever been before, because a lot of their, unless you're a huge name, a lot of your market has disappeared. A lot of the sort of, the middle ground has fallen out of the art market because it's not so easy to see that stuff online. The bigger artists are boosted up. The larger galleries have the better online, viewing rooms and the bigger production values and all the rest of it. So I think artists, having been occasionally, you don't see too many artists at art fairs, but you see them doing the talks and you see them hanging around at the parties and things like that. But I think you see more. I think people have realised how much they've missed them. I went to Photo London a couple of weeks ago, and it was really, really busy, and it was really nice to see as a kind of test bed, you might say, for something as big as Art Basel. It was really nice to see. And it was nice to see lots of photographers there, lots of people really engaged and using it as a curatorial exercise and as a social gathering as much as a marketplace. So all these ingredients kind of go into that sort of happy soup that I think we'll experience in Basel.
That was Robert Bound in conversation with Tom Edwards. And to hear more about Art Basel and the current state of the art market, listen to this week's episode of The Bulletin with UBS. Well, let's continue now with today's newspapers. And joining me in the studio, hurrah, is author, consultant and expert on US foreign policy and international security, Jacob Parakilis. Welcome, Jacob.
Good morning. It's good to be back.
It's really lovely to have you here. France is very cross.
They are continuing to be very cross about losing the submarine deal with Australia in favor of the AUKUS, Australian, US, UK nuclear submarine deal. Last week, the French withdrew their ambassadors, or recalled them for consultations, which is a step below complete withdrawal, to Australia and the US. Didn't withdraw their ambassador here in London, but they've now cancelled a bilateral defense ministerial, which was scheduled for this coming week, indicating that the immediate future of British-French defense cooperation is a little bit shaky as a result of this new deal.
And there are some suggestions that France could be involved in this new deal and that would sort it out.
They could be brought in. The problem fundamentally is that you have at some point an Australian decision about whose submarines to buy. You can't just take blocks of American and British and French submarines and make a sort of transformer submarine composed of all three of them, not without massively inflating the cost. So at some point, the Australians are going to have to pick either American or British design fundamentals and anger the other side. So adding a third party to that doesn't necessarily simplify the diplomatic issue. But yeah, I mean, you could, and I'm sure diplomats in London and Washington are thinking about ways to assuage French anger right now. I mean, I hope they are. Maybe they just think that the French eventually will come back on side because the other side is China, and they don't think the French will go as far as that. I mean, I think the solution is going to be some other type of arrangement, possibly not involving submarines, possibly involving some kind of replacement contract, replacement system, or replacement agreement that would make the French happy.
Let's move on to The Telegraph, page 1, and it's all about Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, who is in America this week.
UK Prime Minister and former Daily Telegraph correspondent, so I think that's always worth mentioning when we're talking about Boris Johnson and The Telegraph. He is in the US this week. He is starting in New York at the General Assembly. He's then going to go down for his first White House meeting with Joe Biden. Actually, his first White House meeting since he became PM, as he never made it to Washington during the Trump administration. And The Telegraph, I think, sort of identifying the issue that a lot of their readership will be most interested in is headlining the idea that Johnson will be pressing the issue of when British citizens will be allowed to come to the United States, when those existing coronavirus restrictions will be lifted. And it's important to mention, they're not bilateral. Americans can come to Britain, or at least vaccinated Americans can come to Britain right now without too much hassle. The same doesn't apply in reverse. And I think Johnson will probably be making that point of on the basis of fairness to Biden.
I wonder how you see the Johnson-Biden relationship.
It's a little bit unsettled. I mean, I think one problem for Johnson is that he made some indelicate, borderline racist comments about Barack Obama. Biden clearly has a very close relationship with Obama and a great deal of affection for and loyalty to him. So I think that is probably not out of his mind entirely. On the other hand, Biden is pragmatic. He understands that Britain is an important ally to the United States. I think the big political issue is the ongoing dispute over the Irish border, the protocol, the sort of post-Brexit complications there. Biden obviously was not a fan of Brexit, continues to believe that it was not the right thing to do, and sort of managing that aspect of the relationship is going to be difficult. But I think that's fundamentally a political issue. I don't think Biden is so transfixed by identity issues that he's not willing to deal with that in a pragmatic and professional way.
Now, earlier in the show, we were talking about the Med7 group and how the Greek Prime Minister has said that this is no longer climate change, it's climate crisis. We're right in the middle of it. Of course, we've got COP26 coming up in Glasgow next month. Boris Johnson has been talking about this and about how to finance it.
Yeah, and that's the front page of the Times. Johnson, it'll be tough getting richer nations to pay for climate. He's trying to get $100 billion in donations from rich countries to poorer countries for climate mitigation and green development. And they're at about 20 billion short of the goal. And I think he's kind of trying to set expectations a little bit below that 100 billion level. 100 billion is a lot of money. It's also relative to the need a little bit of a drop in the bucket. You're talking about making sure that economies can function and develop, that people who live in developing countries have the opportunity to, expand their standard of living, even as temperatures climb and the seas rise and patterns of agriculture and livability change radically and very quickly. So, it's certainly good. It's better than the alternative that he's pushing for it, but I think it's also not necessarily adequate to the problem.
What would be?
Wholesale transformation of our entire civilization.
It's just impossible to say, isn't it?
Or some kind of, you could imagine a wide-scale adoption of some kind of transformative power technology, fusion energy, for example, accompanied with significantly better battery and power storage solutions. That would be the sort of capitalist solution to the problem. If those things are feasible in a few years and are rolled out massively and in a vaguely equitable way, those are pretty much the options.
Well, COP26, of course, is what we're pinning our hopes on. Finally, let's go to the New York Times.
The New York Times sort of teases a story on the front page and then picks it up on page 7 about Shang-Chi, the newest Marvel Cinematic Universe film, with a bit of a racist backstory, which has been remade starring people like Michelle Yeoh, who are, big names in Hong Kong and Chinese cinema. Much of the dialogue's in Mandarin. It's a real, I think, as far as these things go, it's a real effort to make a character that's actually in some ways authentic, at least as far as superheroes go. But it hasn't been cleared for release in the People's Republic of China. It's available in Hong Kong. It's available, and it's done quite well and gotten good reviews elsewhere in Asia and in North America, Europe, and elsewhere. But the very heavily censored but potentially very lucrative Chinese film market has not actually opened it. So the question which the article poses and doesn't really answer is this just a sign of how bad U.S.-Chinese relations have gotten, that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is now a pawn to our ordinary non-superheroic geopolitics, or is there something else at play?
How extraordinary. Yeah. Maybe it's just not a great movie.
Or, well, to be clear, I haven't seen it, but it has gotten good reviews. That's not necessarily always a sign of quality, but it's usually somewhat indicative, at least.
Yeah. Jacob, lovely to see you again. That was Jacob Parakilis, and this is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Join Monocle 24 every day and let the briefing guide and inspire you through uncertain times, always keeping you ahead of the curve. Hear razor-sharp insights and opinion from a lineup of brilliant minds every day.
It's devolving to a point where we're at odds with each other instead of letting our political leaders do the dirty work, so to speak.
Catch up with Monocle's bureau and correspondents around the world. Heavyweight coverage, no white noise, and always delivered with a smile.
I think the grey areas lead to a lot of sort of awkward conversations, and there's nothing the English dislike more than awkward conversations.
Every weekday at 1300 CET, midday in London and 7 a.m. in New York City. Keep your appointment with The Briefing, weekdays on Monocle 24.
This is The Globalist on Monocle 24. I'm Georgina Godwin, and it's time to hear what's new in the world of aviation with Flight Global Head of Strategic Content, Murdo Morrison. Good morning to you, Murdo.
Good morning, Georgina. Hi.
So we're looking at the changes to the UK traffic light system and the airlines' response to that. Tell us more.
Well, in short, Georgina, airlines are delighted by this, but that's really got to be put against, the position that they've been in, the situation that they've been in over the summer, where as other European markets have opened up and eased their COVID test and regulations much more than the UK has, the UK-based airlines and travel out of the UK has been much more constrained over the busy summer months. And of course, these are the months that the airlines and then the whole travel industry really have to make hay, because that's when they make the most of their revenue. They've kind of lost that opportunity, but there is a chance now with the school half-term holiday in October, and perhaps people taking the opportunity to get some sort of autumn and winter sun, that there will be a surge in bookings, and we've already seen that. So airlines in the UK very, very happy at that news.
But how easy, though, is it to travel? I mean, one just keeps hearing horror stories about congestion at airports and utter chaos in queues.
Yeah, it's pretty terrible. I mean, I think there's two sort of factors. One is exactly that. It's the queues at airports, the congestion. When you're trying to avoid COVID, to be packed into an arrivals hall with hundreds of other people in very little social distancing going on is probably not the best situation to have. And the other sort of deterrent that travellers have faced is the cost of getting tested, which in the UK can be as much as £100 per person by the time you get the pre-departure test and the test that you have to get 2 days after coming back, and that's when you're fully vaccinated. So it's been a lot of hassle and expensive and just not a great experience, and that's really put a lot of people off travelling, even though people are really desperate to get away after such a long period of the pandemic.
Now, the US airlines were doing quite well, but that's no longer the case, is it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the in the first half of the year, as everyone else was suffering in lockdowns, and if you were with countries such as India were having an incredible wave of infections, the US was really opening up, and with it, its domestic travel in particular, and to such an extent that the airlines, having laid off a lot of pilots and decommissioned aircraft, were really struggling to get their capacity back. There were even cases of flights being cancelled because the airlines just didn't have the capacity to meet the demand. But really, the rise of the Delta variant over the summer, and particularly in the last 4 or 5 weeks, has really put a dampener on some of that enthusiasm. We're not necessarily seeing travel restrictions, legal restrictions in the US, but this is more driven by consumer behavior. People are just getting a little bit more nervous now about flying, and especially now as business travel would normally be sort of coming back after the summer holiday period. That is not coming back as quickly as people were hoping. Business people are not traveling as much as we might have expected them to, and there's some worry among the airline community in the US and the major airlines over what the next 3 or 4 months will bring.
Although it's very difficult for an airline to die, isn't it?
Well, this is the strange thing about this crisis, because when COVID started and most of the world's fleet was grounded, there was very, very few flights, and we've been in and out of that for over 18 months. And you'd think there would be a swathe of airlines that had perhaps been struggling before the crisis going out of business, and we've not really seen that. Now, that's a combination of airlines being, their costs have come straight down, and they've sort of gone into hibernation, and a lot of them have been given soft loans by creditors or even by governments through various backdoors. And one of these is Alitalia. Now, Alitalia, the Italian state airline, has been in trouble for years. It's almost always been in trouble, Alitalia. It's been bailed out, and of course, European Union laws make it difficult for the Italian government to give it a direct bailout. Now, Alitalia went into administration, and the successor airline called ITA has been born. in all but name, it is the same as Alitalia, and it's expected to more or less take over from Alitalia in the next few weeks. And even the Alitalia name, which regulators are making, the administrators are going to charge a fee to whatever company buys the Alitalia name. It even looks as if the new successor airline will end up buying the brand, buying the Alitalia name. So, after all that, we could just see Alitalia back before the end of the year.
And what about private aviation, Murdo? Is that more popular than usual now?
Yeah, private aviation has been a strange one during this crisis. Because again, you'd expect people just bored of lockdowns and so on, people just wouldn't be flying. But the very high net worth individuals always seem to find a way around some of the regulations. And people who need to travel and can afford to fly privately have managed to throughout the crisis. And coupled to that, there's a feeling that maybe some companies that would have used first class travel in airlines have sort of abandoned that and moved to private aviation because of the security, the convenience, and the fact that you can get from A to B, which hasn't been the case for much of the past 18 months. So while, in the US particularly, but really throughout the world, as airlines have struggled, private aviation has actually thrived. And the latest figures show that sales of business aircraft are actually up on 2020, which is perhaps hardly surprising given the fact that we were right in the middle of the crisis for much of 2020. But even included that first quarter of 2020, before pre-COVID, business travel has been up. So it's a sector that's actually done incredibly well during this crisis.
Murdo, thank you very much indeed. That's Murdo Morrison. And this is The Globalist on Monocle 24. Finally, on today's show, we take a look at a new photo book showcasing the varied world of the newsroom. For the past 6 years, photographer and senior lecturer at the University of Suffolk, Noel Bowler, has been taking photos of newspaper newsrooms across the globe, including the Washington Post, Japan's Asahi Shimbun and The Hindu for his new book Above the Fold. Sebastian Stevenson sat down with Noel to find out more about the diversity of the modern newsroom and how the book came together. He began by asking him which of the newsrooms was most interesting to capture.
They're all interesting for different reasons. I think for me to have the access that I've had, for people to trust the work that I make and to trust me sort of in their environment. I suppose one of the important things to point out here is that when I organise photographing in these newsrooms, as you'll tell by the images, there's nobody in them, and that's quite a difficult thing to organise in this day and age, as newspapers run generally 24/7, whether it's an evening print run or a morning print run. So a lot of the access was organised on a Sunday morning at about 6 a.m, where it was generally the quietest place or the quietest part of the newsroom. When I walk the floors, I kind of come in with a plan in my head, but I sort of let the space respond in some way. So I try to take as much time as I can just to think about the space. I tend to walk the floors, look at the desks, look at the details of the office, and you get a sense of the people that work there. You get a sense whether it's coats on the back of chairs, there's kind of shoes under the table, there's piles and piles of paperwork on each desk. As the project develops, or has it developed over time, I began to notice changes in the office space themselves. One of the earlier spaces I was a huge fan of because I think it was probably the oldest space, which was the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. It looked like the newsroom hadn't been changed or upgraded in any way for many, many years. And there's an attraction to that for me. There was kind of a nostalgia to it. You could picture the room full of journalists. You could picture people smoking. You could hear the sound of typewriters and all those kind of cliches. As kind of I moved between more modern news offices and newsrooms, that everything began to look kind of the same. And those similarities were the attraction. The furniture was very similar. The newsroom could have been countries apart, but some of those little aesthetics were all the same, whether it was the chairs, the desks. But what made each one slightly different was the evidence of people. And those little details, whether it's photographs on the desk, as I say, items of clothing, and that space almost begins to speak a small bit. I think the future of this will be different, though. I think like a lot of office spaces, I think this idea of, you know, working together in a communal space and trying to make it something for that individual will be gone. I think we're now going to be hot desking, if we're allowed to have a desk to begin with. And I think those elements are going to change in the way we see work and the way we adapt to it.
That's interesting you said about, you know, because that was an observation when reading through the copy you provided me, that if you weren't paying attention necessarily to the images, you were sort of skimming through it, you might think you photographed just one newsroom. And it's only when you look at sort of the index at the end of the book that you see that actually we went from the New York Times, Washington Post, Asahi Shimbun. So that was something you maybe lent into a little bit?
Yeah, and I think what I wanted to be able to, I mean, you're 100% correct. Some of those spaces, they all look like it could be the one building. And I wanted people to consider that a lot of the time, especially in this world now, when we're looking at information and news and it's, you know, we're scrolling through screens, what I was, in some ways I was trying to get across is that there's a huge amount of people involved in creating genuine news. There's a process that involves human decision making. And a sort of a reminder, I think, that those levels do exist, from editorial to correction to management, that we can see all those levels within the paper somewhat. We can see the amount of desks and tables and chairs and the cost to generate actual news. But, you know, I think it's an important reminder that actually genuine and real news does involve people and not just a tagline or a hashtag or something.
And looking at newsrooms, did you find anything in terms of, because now most newsrooms are virtual or not, they're not quite back in the physical newsroom, do you think there is a value in a physical building from what you saw? And I guess that, you know, messaging over Slack or Zoom just doesn't quite cut it.
I think so. I think we've all learned that the value of human contact at some level. I mean, there has to be a way to fact check and talk and meet each other in any kind of office environment to be inspired. That said, over the years, I've revisited many newsrooms that have been kind of even done up in the time that I was doing the project. And you noticed there was a move towards the open plan, where everybody sits together and was supposed to be more productive. I think you'll then find that there was a lot of noise. Everybody has to wear headphones so, you know, they can concentrate. There was then this development of quiet spaces within the newsroom, which almost seemed counterproductive. You'll see it in modern offices too, that there were small little rooms that are soundproofed or boxes you could go to make a phone call. One of my photographs of the Wall Street Journal, you'll see those two they look like modern telephone boxes. And what they are there's only limited space to stand up in, really, to go and have a bit of quiet private time and to make a discussion or to make a call that no one else can hear. So you're seeing these evolutions within the office and how we think and how we work. And I think that's evident as well between some of the pictures.
That was Noel Blower in conversation with Sebastian Stevenson. And to hear the full interview, tune into this week's edition of The Stack. And that's all for today's show. Thanks to our producers, Marcus Hippie, Daniel Bache and Charlie Filmer-Court, our researcher, Sophie Monaghan-Coombs, and our studio manager, Sam Impey, with editing assistance from Sean Hickey. After the headlines, there's music on the way, and The Briefing is live at midday in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. I'll return on The Globalist at the same time tomorrow. Thank you for listening.
Monocle and UBS are proud to present A Nobel Cause, a book that celebrates more than half a century of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. A Nobel Cause gives an overview of the 84 winning laureates and their influence on global society. It builds excitement around economics by talking to the laureates and unpacking their theories, from a pioneer in the field of the economics of climate change to an Israeli psychologist who changed the way we think about thinking. The winners' stories make for an incredibly diverse read. As well as real-life case studies of applications of the prize-winning theories, you'll find an illustrated history of global economics. Alongside a look ahead at what we can expect over the next 50 years, you can discover the story of Alfred Nobel himself and the legacy of his awards. On sale from October 2020 from Monocle and UBS. Purchase the book from our retail stores or from monocle.com. A Nobel Cause, asking the questions that shape our world.